The morning sun felt warm on Lisa's face as she stood on the dock, one hand resting on the smooth railing of her sailboat. She had waited for this moment for years. Every weekend she'd spent learning to sail, every course she'd taken, every night she'd studied weather patterns and navigation charts had all led to this day. She was finally ready to sail across the Caribbean by herself. Her boat wasn't fancy or expensive. It was 28 feet long, white with blue trim, and she'd bought it used 3 years ago. But she knew every inch of it. She'd repaired the deck herself, replaced the rigging, and spent countless hours getting it ready for this journey. The boat had a small cabin below deck where she could sleep, a tiny kitchen area, and just enough room to store supplies for a week at sea. Lisa took one last look at Key West behind her. The marina was busy with tourists and fishermen getting ready for their day. She could smell coffee from the cafe on the pier and hear the sound of boat engines starting up. Part of her wanted to stay in this safe, familiar place, but a bigger part of her needed to prove she could do this. She'd checked the weather forecast 3 times that morning. Clear skies, light winds, perfect conditions for the next 72 hours. The Coast Guard station had her float plan. Her family knew her route. Everything was in order. At 9 in the morning, she untied the last rope and pushed away from the dock. The engine hummed to life, and she guided her boat out of the marina. Once she cleared the harbor, she cut the engine and raised the sails. The canvas snapped and filled with wind, and suddenly she was moving, really moving, with nothing but the power of the wind pushing her forward. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The water was that impossible shade of blue-green that you only see in the Caribbean. Flying fish leaped out of the waves, their silvery bodies catching the sunlight. A pod of dolphins appeared alongside her boat, playing in the wake. Lisa laughed out loud, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was why she'd worked so hard. This feeling of freedom, of being completely alive. She ate lunch on deck, just a simple sandwich and an apple, but it tasted better than any meal she'd had in a restaurant. The sun moved across the sky and she adjusted her course, checking her compass and GPS regularly. By late afternoon of her second day at sea, she'd covered almost 150 miles. She was right on schedule. That's when she noticed the horizon. It started as just a dark smudge in the distance, so faint she almost thought she was imagining it. But over the next 30 minutes, the smudge grew into a line of dark clouds. Lisa frowned and checked her weather radio. The forecast still called for clear conditions, but those clouds didn't look right. They were too dark, moving too fast. She turned on her marine radio and listened to the weather channels. Static crackled through the speaker, then a voice cut through, urgent and tense. A tropical storm had formed unexpectedly in the last few hours. It was moving fast and getting stronger. The forecaster rattled off coordinates and Lisa felt her stomach drop. The storm was heading straight toward her position. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory from all her training taking over. She needed to reduce sail area immediately. She clipped her safety harness to the boat and moved forward to lower the large front sail. The wind was already picking up, making the fabric snap and fight against her. By the time she'd secured it, sweat was running down her back despite the cooling air. The clouds were racing toward her now, covering the sun. The water changed color from bright blue to a dark, angry gray. Waves that had been gentle swells began to build, growing taller and steeper. Lisa went below deck and started securing everything loose. Water bottles, cooking pots, books, tools, anything that could become a dangerous projectile in rough seas got stowed away or tied down. She tried her radio again, calling out her position and situation. "This is sailing vessel Blue Horizon, Blue Horizon. I'm at coordinates." Static swallowed her words. She tried again and again, but the interference from the storm made communication impossible. Her satellite phone was in the cabin. She grabbed it, but the screen showed no signal. The storm was blocking everything. The first real gust of wind hit like a punch. The boat heeled over sharply and Lisa grabbed the wheel to steady herself. Rain began to fall. Not the gentle tropical rain she'd experienced before, but hard drops that stung her skin. Within minutes, it became a wall of water so thick she could barely see 10 feet in front of her. The waves were monsters now, 15 feet tall and growing. Her boat would climb up the face of one wave, hang at the top for a heart-stopping moment, then crash down into the trough on the other side. Each impact sent shudders through the hull. Lisa's world became a nightmare of howling wind, pounding rain, and endless waves. She'd put on her life jacket and double-checked her harness. Her hands gripped the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Hours blurred together. Day turned to night, but she couldn't tell because the sky was just as dark either way. Her arms ached. Her legs trembled from bracing herself against the wild movements of the boat. She was soaked through, cold despite the tropical heat and more scared than she'd ever been in her life. A massive wave rose up in front of her, bigger than all the others. It looked like a moving wall of black water. Lisa screamed, though her voice was lost in the roar of the storm. The wave crashed over the stern of her boat with the force of a truck. She felt the world spin, felt herself lifted and thrown, felt the safety harness cut into her ribs. Then everything went dark. The last thing she remembered was the taste of salt water and the sound of her boat breaking apart around her. After that, nothing. Just darkness and the distant roar of the storm, fading away into silence. The first thing Lisa felt was heat. Intense, burning heat on her face and arms. Then came the pain, a dull ache that seemed to radiate from everywhere at once. Her head throbbed. Her ribs felt bruised. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She opened her eyes slowly, squinting against the brightness. Blue sky, blinding sun, the sound of waves gently lapping at the shore. For a confused moment she thought she was still on her boat, that maybe the storm had been a nightmare. But when she tried to move, her hand touched sand instead of deckboards. Lisa pushed herself up slowly, wincing at every movement. She was lying on a beach. White sand stretched in both directions, and behind her was a line of palm trees and thick green vegetation. In front of her, the ocean sparkled peacefully under the afternoon sun, as if the storm had never happened. Her boat. Where was her boat? She turned her head and felt her heart sink. Pieces of her sailboat were scattered along the beach like broken toys. A section of the hull rested against some rocks. The mast lay snapped in half further down the shore. Bits of rope, torn canvas, and splintered wood were everywhere. Her beautiful boat, the one she'd worked so hard to prepare, was destroyed. Lisa stood up on shaky legs and immediately felt dizzy. She sat back down, breathing slowly until the world stopped spinning. She had no idea how long she'd been unconscious. The sun was high in the sky, so it was probably midday. But was it the same day the storm hit? Or had she been lying on this beach for longer? She looked down at herself. Her clothes were torn and crusted with salt. Her left arm had a nasty scrape already scabbed over. Her life jacket was still strapped around her chest, though it was ripped in places. She touched her face gently and felt a tender lump on her forehead. She'd been lucky. Incredibly lucky. She should probably be dead. The beach was small, maybe 100 yards long and curved like a crescent. Beyond the palm trees, she could see higher ground rising up. This was an island. A small island, and from what she could see, there was no sign of people anywhere. No houses, no boats, no pier. Nothing but sand, trees, and rocks. Lisa felt panic rising in her chest. She forced herself to breathe slowly. First things first. She needed to see what she could salvage from the wreckage. Maybe her radio had survived. Maybe her satellite phone was still working. She walked along the beach, checking each piece of debris. Most of it was useless, just broken fiberglass and twisted metal. But then she spotted something orange bobbing in the shallow water near the rocks. Her emergency kit. The waterproof container was still sealed. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was everything she'd packed for worst-case scenarios. A fixed blade knife in a sheath. A basic first aid kit with bandages, antiseptic, and pain medication. A water purification pump with extra filters. 6 energy bars in sealed packages. A small emergency blanket. A waterproof box of matches. And a signal mirror, but no radio, no phone. No way to call for help. Lisa sat down hard on the sand, the emergency kit clutched in her lap. The reality of her situation was starting to hit her. She was stranded on an island with no way to communicate with anyone. Her family would know something was wrong when she didn't reach her scheduled check-in point. The Coast Guard would start searching, but they'd be looking along her planned route. This island, wherever it was, probably wasn't anywhere near where she was supposed to be. The storm could have pushed her miles off course in any direction. She pulled out the laminated map she'd kept in the pocket of her sailing jacket. The plastic was scratched and the map was faded, but she could still read it. She studied the dozens of small islands scattered across this part of the Caribbean. Which one was this? There were so many tiny islands, and many of them looked the same from sea level. Without her GPS or any landmarks she recognized, she had no way of knowing where she was. The sun was getting lower in the sky. Lisa realized she'd been sitting on the beach for too long, letting shock and fear paralyze her. She needed to take action. She needed water. She needed shelter. She needed to think clearly and make a plan. She walked the full length of the beach looking for any other useful debris. She found a plastic container that had held rope, now empty but watertight, perfect for collecting and storing water. She found a tarp that was ripped but still mostly intact. She found several lengths of rope that weren't too damaged. And she found her boat's small anchor, still attached to several feet of chain. As she worked, Lisa's mind kept circling back to the same questions. How far had the storm carried her? Was she anywhere near shipping lanes? Did anyone ever come to this island? She climbed up to the tree line and looked around more carefully. The island seemed tiny, maybe a quarter-mile across at its widest point. Through gaps in the vegetation, she could see the ocean on the other side. No sign of any other land nearby. She was completely isolated. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the sky orange and pink. Lisa had maybe an hour of good daylight left. She chose a spot near the trees, protected from wind but still visible from the beach. Using pieces of her boat and some fallen palm fronds, she started building a basic shelter. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep the sun off during the day and provide some protection at night. She used the water pump on a small stream she'd found trickling down from higher ground. The water was clear and cold. She filled the plastic container and drank deeply, trying to replace what she'd lost through dehydration. Her body needed water desperately. When darkness finally came, it came fast. One moment there was light, and the next the world was black except for the stars. More stars than Lisa had ever seen in her life, spread across the sky like glittering sand. The Milky Way was a bright river overhead. In any other circumstance, it would have been beautiful. Lisa lay in her makeshift shelter, her body aching, her mind racing. She thought about her mother, who was probably sick with worry by now. She thought about her younger brother, who'd told her this solo trip was a bad idea. She thought about all the people who'd be searching for her in all the wrong places. A single tear rolled down her cheek and then another. She let herself cry quietly in the darkness, letting out the fear and shock and grief for everything she'd lost. But she didn't cry for long. Crying wouldn't help. She needed to be strong. She needed to survive. Tomorrow she would figure out how to get rescued. Tonight she just needed to rest and heal. The sound of waves was constant and oddly soothing. Despite everything, exhaustion eventually pulled her down into sleep. Lisa woke up to the sound of birds. Not the gentle chirping of songbirds, but harsh squawking from seagulls fighting over something on the beach. Her whole body felt stiff and sore, like she'd been hit by a car. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then reality came crashing back. The storm. The island. Being completely alone. She crawled out of her shelter and stood in the early morning light. The ocean was calm, almost flat, reflecting the pink and orange sky. It looked so peaceful, so innocent. Nothing like the monster that had destroyed her boat and left her stranded here. Her stomach growled painfully. She'd eaten one energy bar the night before, but that was all she'd had in at least 2 days, maybe longer. She wasn't even sure anymore. She had 5 energy bars left. If she ate one per day, that gave her less than a week. She needed to find real food. The tide pools between the rocks seemed like a good place to start. Lisa walked carefully across the slippery stones, watching where she put her feet. The pools were full of life. Small fish darted between the rocks. Crabs scuttled sideways into crevices. Sea urchins clung to the underwater surfaces like dark purple pin cushions. She'd never caught fish with her bare hands before, but she'd watched videos about survival fishing. The key was patience and quick reflexes. She stood very still, her hand hovering just above the water. A small fish swam close. She waited, then struck, her hand plunging into the water. The fish slipped through her fingers. She tried again, and again. On her 7th attempt, she actually caught one. It wasn't big, maybe the length of her hand, but it was food. Real food. She felt a rush of pride mixed with guilt as the fish stopped moving. She'd never killed anything before, but she needed to eat. She needed to survive. Using her knife, she cleaned the fish like she'd seen in survival shows. It wasn't pretty, and she almost got sick halfway through, but she managed. Building a fire was easier than she'd expected. The matches from her emergency kit worked, and she found plenty of dry palm fronds for kindling. Soon she had a small fire going, and the smell of cooking fish filled the air. It was the best meal she'd ever tasted. Or maybe she was just that hungry. Either way, she ate every bit, even picking the bones clean. Her stomach stopped hurting quite so much. Over the next few days, Lisa fell into a routine. She'd wake up at dawn and check the beach for any debris that might have washed up overnight. She'd collect rainwater when it rained, which happened almost every afternoon for about 20 minutes. She improved her shelter, making it stronger and more comfortable. She caught fish and learned to find coconuts, though opening them without proper tools was exhausting work. But the nights were the hardest. During the day, she could keep busy. She could focus on the practical tasks of staying alive. But at night, when there was nothing to do but lie in her shelter and listen to the ocean, her mind went to dark places. She thought about her mother constantly. Her mom lived alone in a small apartment in Miami. Lisa was supposed to call her every day during the trip. By now, her mother would have contacted the Coast Guard. She'd be imagining the worst. The not knowing would be torture for her. Lisa felt guilty for putting her through this. She thought about her brother, too. They'd had a fight before she left. He'd said she was being selfish taking this trip alone. She'd told him he was being overprotective. Their last conversation had ended with both of them angry. What if she never got to tell him she was sorry? What if those angry words were the last things they ever said to each other? On the 5th day, or maybe it was the 6th, Lisa lost count. She climbed to the highest point on the island. It wasn't really a hill, just a rocky outcropping maybe 30 feet above sea level. But from there she could see in all directions. Ocean. Nothing but ocean in every direction. No other islands. No boats, no planes. Just endless blue water meeting endless blue sky. She sat down on the rocks and felt despair wash over her. What if nobody found her? What if she died here on this island? People died alone all the time. Ships sank. Planes crashed. Hikers got lost in the woods. Sometimes they were never found. Sometimes they just disappeared, and their families never knew what happened to them. Lisa pulled her knees up to her chest and rocked back and forth. She felt tears coming and didn't try to stop them. She cried until her throat hurt and her eyes burned. She cried for herself, for her family, for the life she might never get back to. She cried until there were no tears left. Then something inside her shifted. She wiped her face and stood up. No, she wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to die here. She was going to survive, and she was going to get rescued, and she was going to see her family again. She just needed to figure out how. That night she kept her fire burning, not just for cooking or warmth, but as a signal. If a boat or plane passed nearby at night, they might see it. It was a small chance, but it was something. She collected extra firewood during the day so she could keep the flames going after dark. She also started marking the days. Using a sharp rock, she scratched lines into the trunk of a palm tree near her shelter. One line for each day. It helped her keep track of time, gave her something concrete to hold on to. Otherwise, the days would all blur together into one endless stretch of survival. On what she counted as day 10, she saw her first plane. It was just a tiny speck in the sky, the sound of its engines barely audible. Lisa ran out onto the beach, waving her arms and screaming even though she knew they couldn't hear her. She grabbed her signal mirror and flashed it toward the plane, trying to catch the sun just right. But the plane was too far away, too high up. It passed by without changing course, and then it was gone. Lisa sank down onto the sand, breathing hard. She'd gotten her hopes up for nothing. But at least now she knew planes did fly over this area. Maybe not often, but they did fly over. That meant she had a chance. She just needed to be ready for the next one. That night she lay awake for a long time, staring up at the stars. She started talking out loud even though there was nobody to hear her. She talked about her childhood, about learning to swim in the community pool. She talked about the first time she'd gone sailing, how scared and excited she'd been. She talked about her dreams, the places she wanted to see, the things she wanted to do. Talking helped. It made her feel less alone, less like she was going crazy. She made a promise to herself. Every night she'd talk. She'd tell stories, sing songs, recite poems she'd learned in school, anything to keep her mind active, to remind herself that she was still human, still alive, still fighting. The ocean whispered against the shore. The fire crackled softly, and Lisa kept talking, her voice steady and strong in the darkness, refusing to let the silence win. Lisa scratched another line into the palm tree. 14 days, 2 weeks on this island with no rescue in sight. She'd seen 3 more planes since that first one, but they'd all been too high, too far away. Her signal mirror hadn't made any difference. Her fires at night were too small to be noticed from the air. She needed something bigger, something impossible to miss. The idea came to her while she was sorting through the boat debris for the 100th time. She'd been avoiding the largest piece of wreckage, a section of sail that had washed up tangled in some rope. It made her too sad to look at it, a reminder of everything she'd lost. But now she pulled it free and spread it out on the sand. It was her spinnaker, the large sail she'd used for downwind sailing, bright red, impossible to miss on the water. And somehow, despite everything the storm had thrown at it, the sail was mostly intact. There were a few small tears, but the fabric was still strong. Most importantly, it was huge. Nearly 40 feet across when fully opened, Lisa's heart started beating faster. This could work. This could actually work. If she could lay this out somewhere visible, somewhere a pilot might look down and see it, she might have a real chance at being rescued. But she needed to be smart about it. She needed to make it unmistakable. Not just a piece of red fabric, but an obvious distress signal. She spent the rest of that day planning. The beach was the most visible spot from the air, but the sand was too loose. The tide came in twice a day and would wash everything away. She needed higher ground, somewhere flat enough to lay out the sail, somewhere that wouldn't flood. The next morning, she found the perfect spot. On the eastern side of the island, there was a flat rocky area about 20 feet above sea level. It was bare rock, bleached white by the sun, with just a few scattered bushes. From the air, the contrast between the white rock and red sail would be striking. Getting the sail up there was exhausting. It was heavy with seawater and awkward to carry. Lisa had to stop and rest 3 times, her muscles burning, sweat pouring down her face despite the ocean breeze. But finally she had it in position. Now came the hard part. She needed to spell something out. Help would be the obvious choice. But she needed materials to make letters big enough to be seen from an airplane. She walked the island looking for anything she could use. Driftwood was scattered along the beaches. Pieces of white coral had collected in tide pools. Dark volcanic rocks were piled in certain areas. And dried seaweed, blackened by the sun, was everywhere. Lisa started collecting. She filled her arms with coral pieces and carried them to her signal site. Then she went back for driftwood. Then rocks. Then seaweed. Trip after trip until her legs felt like rubber and her shoulders ached. She worked through the afternoon heat, only stopping to drink water and catch her breath. By sunset, she had piles of materials ready, but she was too tired to do more. She ate a fish she'd caught earlier, watched the sun sink into the ocean, and fell asleep the moment she lay down in her shelter. The next 2 days were the hardest physical work she'd ever done. Lisa measured out her letters by counting steps. Each letter needed to be at least 10 feet tall to be visible from a plane. She started with H, using the white coral pieces to form the vertical lines and crossbar. It took hours just to make that one letter. Her hands got cut and scraped from handling the sharp coral. Her back screamed in protest every time she bent down to place another piece. But she kept going. The E was next, then the L, then P. She used the dark volcanic rocks to create a border around the letters, making them stand out even more against the white stone. She weighted down the red sail with larger rocks at each corner and along the edges, creating a massive red rectangle behind the white letters. When she finally finished, Lisa climbed back down to the beach and walked as far away as she could. Then she turned and looked up. Even from ground level, the signal was impressive. The bright red sail screamed for attention. The white letters spelling help stood out clearly against it. Dark rocks formed a border that made the whole thing look intentional, unmistakable. From the air, it would be even more obvious. It had to be. She'd put everything she had into this. That afternoon, she added one more element. Using pieces of driftwood and rope from her boat, she built a frame near the beach. She hung her orange life jacket on it, positioning it to be visible from multiple angles. She placed her signal mirror nearby, ready to grab if she heard a plane. She even arranged some of her boat debris and patterns on the beach, anything to create more visual signals that something was wrong, that someone needed help. Lisa stood back and surveyed her work. She'd turned this tiny island into a giant distress beacon. Every visible surface had some kind of signal. The red sail and white letters on the plateau, the orange life jacket on the beach, the patterns of debris, the fire pit she kept ready to light at a moment's notice. She'd done everything she could think of. Now came the hardest part, waiting. Days passed with agonizing slowness. Lisa maintained her routine of fishing, collecting water, and keeping herself alive. But now she also maintained her signals. Every morning she'd climb up to check the sail, making sure no pieces had blown away overnight. She'd reposition rocks that had shifted. She'd add more seaweed to the letters to keep them dark and visible. She started spending hours just sitting on the beach watching the sky. Every time she heard an engine, even if it was so faint she wasn't sure it was real, her heart would leap. She'd grab her signal mirror and stand ready, scanning the clouds for any sign of an aircraft. But plane after plane passed too far away, or maybe there were no planes at all. Just the sound of wind playing tricks on her desperate mind. Lisa started to wonder if her signals would ever be seen. What if pilots never looked down? What if they were always too focused on their instruments, their flight paths, their destinations? On the 17th night, Lisa lay in her shelter and allowed herself to feel the full weight of despair. She'd done everything right. She'd survived the storm. She'd learned to find food and water. She'd built the biggest distress signal she could possibly create. But what if it wasn't enough? What if she died here despite all her efforts? She thought about giving up. Just walking into the ocean one morning and swimming until she couldn't swim anymore. It would be easier than this endless cycle of hope and disappointment. Easier than wondering every day if this would be the day someone found her, only to watch another sunset alone. But she couldn't do it. Something deep inside her refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was love for her family. Maybe it was just the basic human instinct to survive. Whatever it was, it kept her going. She crawled out of her shelter and walked down to the water's edge. The moon was nearly full, painting a silver path across the dark ocean. Lisa stood there for a long time, letting the cool water lap at her feet. She wasn't religious, but she found herself praying anyway. Praying to God, to the universe, to anyone who might be listening. "Please," she whispered. "Please let someone see my flag. Please let someone look down. Please don't let me die here alone." The ocean had no answer. The stars glittered silently overhead. And Lisa walked back to her shelter, not knowing that tomorrow everything would change. Captain Mike Chen had been flying cargo routes across the Caribbean for 15 years. He knew these skies better than he knew the streets of his own neighborhood. Every morning he'd climb into his twin-engine cargo plane, run through his pre-flight checks, and take off on the same route he'd flown 1,000 times before. It was routine, comfortable, maybe even a little boring. This morning started like any other. He'd loaded up in Puerto Rico just after dawn, carrying medical supplies and machine parts bound for a hospital and factory in Jamaica. The weather was perfect, clear skies with just a few scattered clouds. He'd filed his flight plan, gotten clearance from air traffic control, and taken off right on schedule. But about an hour into the flight, he got a call from the control tower. There was a weather system developing along his usual route. Nothing dangerous, just some turbulence and low visibility. They suggested he adjust his course slightly, taking a path about 20 miles south of his normal one. Mike didn't mind. After 15 years, a little variety was actually kind of nice. He banked the plane gently, adjusting his heading. Below him, the Caribbean Sea stretched out in every direction. That incredible blue-green color that never got old no matter how many times he saw it. Scattered across the water were dozens of tiny islands, most of them uninhabited. Just little dots of sand and palm trees in the middle of nowhere. He settled into the new course and let his mind wander. His daughter had a piano recital coming up next week. He needed to make sure he had that day off. His wife wanted to repaint the living room. He needed to pick up paint samples. Normal thoughts. Everyday concerns. That's when something caught his eye. It was just a flash of color in his peripheral vision. Something red where there shouldn't be anything red. Mike almost ignored it. These islands all looked the same from up here, and after 15 years of flying over them, his brain had learned to tune them out. But something made him look again. He banked the plane slightly, losing a bit of altitude to get a better view. There on one of the tiny islands below was a large patch of bright red. That was strange. These uninhabited islands didn't have buildings or boats or anything man-made. They were just empty specks of land that nobody visited. Mike leaned closer to the window, squinting. The red patch had white markings on it. Letters. He could actually see letters spelled out. His heart started beating faster. Those letters spelled help. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Someone was down there. Someone was stranded on that island, and they'd made a massive signal to be seen from the air. How long had they been there? How had they ended up on such a remote island? Mike's training kicked in immediately. He grabbed his radio and switched to the emergency frequency. His voice was calm and professional, but his hands were shaking slightly as he keyed the microphone. "This is Cargo Flight 627 to Coast Guard. I have a possible distress situation. I'm observing a large help signal on an uninhabited island. Coordinates are—" He read off the exact position from his GPS, double-checking to make sure he had it right. The Coast Guard operator responded immediately, her voice crisp and focused. "Copy that, 627. Can you confirm visual contact with any individuals?" Mike circled back around, dropping even lower. The plane's engines roared as he reduced speed, trying to get the best view possible. There, on the beach, a person. Someone was running out onto the sand, waving their arms frantically. Even from this height, he could see the desperation in their movements. Confirmed visual contact. One individual appears to be mobile and actively signaling. The distress marker looks professionally constructed. This person has been down there for a while. Roger that. We're dispatching a rescue helicopter immediately. Can you maintain visual contact until they arrive? Mike checked his fuel gauge. He had enough for another hour, maybe a bit more. Affirmative. I'll stay in the area. He circled the island slowly, keeping the person in sight. Down below, they'd stopped running. They were just standing on the beach now, watching his plane. He could imagine what they must be feeling. Relief, disbelief, hope. After however long they'd been stranded down there, seeing his plane must have felt like a miracle. Mike grabbed a notepad and started jotting down observations for the Coast Guard. The person appeared to be wearing torn clothing. There was a shelter visible near the tree line. Debris on the beach that looked like it came from a boat. This wasn't someone who'd crashed a plane or gotten lost while hiking. This was a sailor who'd survived a shipwreck. He thought about the storm that had blown through about 2 weeks ago. The one that had formed unexpectedly and caught everyone off guard. Several boats had called for help during that storm. A few had been rescued, but some had gone silent, their last known positions far from where they were supposed to be. This person had probably been caught in that storm. 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. Mike kept circling, kept watching. He tried to imagine what it must have been like for that person down there. Surviving a storm violent enough to destroy a boat. Washing up on an uninhabited island with no way to call for help. Building that massive signal, not knowing if anyone would ever see it. Waiting day after day, watching planes pass overhead, wondering if this would be the day someone finally looked down, and he'd almost missed it. If the weather hadn't forced him to change his route, he would have flown right past this island 20 miles to the north. That person would still be down there waiting, maybe for days or weeks more, maybe forever. Finally, he heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors over his radio. "Coast Guard helicopter approaching your position, 627. We have visual on your aircraft." Mike looked to the east and saw the orange and white Coast Guard helicopter coming in fast and low. Relief flooded through him. Roger that. The individual is on the eastern beach near a makeshift shelter. They appear to be in relatively good condition, but likely dehydrated and exhausted. The helicopter moved into position over the island. Mike watched as a rescue swimmer was lowered down on a cable. The person on the beach was running toward the swimmer now. Even from his altitude, Mike could see the moment they reached each other. The survivor seemed to collapse into the rescue swimmer's arms. Mike found himself blinking back tears. He'd never rescued anyone before. Sure, he'd reported things he'd seen over the years. Disabled boats, potential hazards. But he'd never found someone who would have died without his help. Someone whose life he'd literally saved just by looking out his window at the right moment. The Coast Guard operator came back on the radio. 627, we have the survivor secured. Female, mid-30s, conscious and responsive. She's been stranded for 17 days. If you hadn't spotted her signal, we estimate she had maybe 3 or 4 more days before dehydration became critical. You saved her life today. Mike had to swallow hard before he could respond. Happy to help. Glad I was in the right place at the right time. More than that. She told our swimmer she'd been watching planes pass by for days. You're the first one who looked down. The helicopter was already heading back toward the mainland, the survivor safely aboard. Mike waited until they were clear, then resumed his course toward Jamaica. His cargo was going to arrive late, but nobody was going to complain about the reason. That night, after he'd landed and filed his reports and finally made it home, Mike sat with his wife and told her the whole story. She listened quietly, then hugged him tight. You're a hero, she whispered. But Mike didn't feel like a hero. He just felt grateful. Grateful that he'd changed his route. Grateful that he'd noticed that flash of red. Grateful that he'd decided to look down instead of staying focused on the horizon ahead, because sometimes that's all it takes. Someone just has to look down, someone just has to see, and one person's entire world can change in an instant.